When 12-year-old Ethan Miller came home from school, the house was too quiet. The food bowl was gone, the old blanket was gone, and the German shepherd, who had guarded him since his father's death, had vanished. Then his stepfather looked up coldly and said, "That damn dog bit me. I called animal control. They took him away." Ethan ran through the snow with tears freezing on his cheeks. At the shelter, he found the dog in the very last cage, scheduled to be put down by morning for being too dangerous. But this was no ordinary dog. He had once been the brave K-9 partner of Ethan's fallen police officer father. He never attacked without reason, and he never abandoned the people he loved. So why was someone so desperate to silence him? Before the night was over, the old K-9 would lead Ethan and Officer Jonathan Hayes to an abandoned cabin and to a secret Ethan's father died trying to protect. Stay with this story until the end, and don't forget to subscribe to support our channel. Now, please enjoy the story. In late November, 3 years after Officer Daniel Miller died in the line of duty, the small town of Briar Glen, Vermont, was already wearing winter like an old gray coat. Snow rested along the rooftops, thin but stubborn. The maple trees had lost their fire-colored leaves weeks ago, and the roads curved between white fields, dark barns, and quiet houses with smoke lifting from their chimneys. It was the kind of town where people waved from pickup trucks, remembered one another's troubles, and still lowered their voices when a patrol car passed the cemetery road. At the end of Hawthorne Lane stood the Miller house. It was a modest white farmhouse with green shutters, a narrow porch, and a red mailbox that leaned slightly to one side. In summer, the place looked gentle, almost cheerful. But in winter, with the yard stiff under frost and the windows glowing early in the afternoon, it seemed to hold its breath. For 12-year-old Ethan Miller, that house had not felt fully alive since his father died. Ethan was a quiet boy with watchful eyes and a heart too large for the small chest that carried it. He had learned far too young how to step softly around adult sadness. He knew which floorboard creaked near the hallway. He knew when his mother was pretending not to cry. He knew how to fold grief into ordinary things, like tying his boots, packing his school bag, or sitting through math class while other children complained about homework. His father, Officer Daniel Miller, had been a respected police K-9 officer in Briar Glen. To most people, Daniel had been brave, steady, and dependable. To Ethan, he had been the man who smelled faintly of coffee, snow, leather gloves, and dog fur. He had been the man who could fix a broken fence, calm a frightened child, and make pancakes shaped like animals so badly that Ethan had to guess what they were. 3 years earlier, Daniel had died during an investigation in the hills north of town. The official report called it a tragic accident during police work. The town mourned him, the department held a service, and the case was eventually closed. But grief did not close as neatly as a file, and neither did Ron. Ron was Daniel's old K-9 partner, a large German shepherd with a black and tan coat, a graying muzzle, and eyes that seemed to understand more than any animal should. He had once tracked missing people, protected officers, and stood beside Daniel through long nights of duty. After Daniel's death, Ron came home to live with Ethan and Grace, not as equipment, not as property, but as the last living piece of Daniel's old world. Ethan believed Ron remembered everything. Sometimes, late at night, Ron would walk to the front door and sit there with his ears raised, as if waiting for Daniel's boots to step onto the porch. Other times, he would rest his head on Ethan's bed during storms, exactly the way he had done the first week after the funeral, when Ethan had cried so hard he could not breathe. Ron never barked without reason. He never snapped. He never begged at the table. He simply watched, listened, and stayed. To Ethan, that was love. To Caleb Ross, it was a problem. Caleb was Ethan's stepfather, a 42-year-old insurance adjuster who had married Grace Miller a little over a year earlier. Around neighbors and church members, he had a calm smile and a smooth voice. He carried grocery bags for older women, shook hands firmly, and said the right things about family, responsibility, and moving forward. Inside the Miller house, he was different. He didn't shout often. He didn't need to. His cruelty came in smaller shapes. A look across the dinner table, a sigh when Ethan spoke too softly, a comment about boys needing to toughen up, a reminder that Daniel was gone, that life could not remain a shrine forever, that dogs did not belong in the center of a family. "That animal is too old for police habits," Caleb said one evening, while Ron lay beside Ethan's chair. "He stares at doors all night. It is not healthy." Ethan kept his fork still over his plate. "He is just watching the house," Ethan said. Caleb smiled without warmth. "That is what I mean." Grace Miller, Ethan's mother, looked up from the stove. She was 38, a receptionist at a small medical clinic, and a woman who had carried grief for so long that peace had begun to look like anything quiet. She loved Ethan deeply. That was never the question, but she was tired in the way lonely people become tired, and Caleb had entered her life offering order, bills paid on time, repairs finished, and a voice that promised she would not have to carry everything alone. "Ethan," Grace said gently, "Caleb is only saying Ron may need more rest now. He is not young anymore." Ron lifted his head at the sound of his name. His ears turned toward Grace, then toward Caleb. Caleb noticed. His jaw tightened. "There," he said. "That look, you see it?" "He looks at everyone," Ethan said. "He watches me like I do not belong in my own house." Ethan wanted to say it was not Caleb's house. It had been Daniel's house first. It was still his mother's house, and one day, maybe partly his. But Ethan had learned that truth could become dangerous when spoken at the wrong table, so he said nothing. Ron placed his chin on Ethan's shoe. The pressure was light, but Ethan felt it like a hand telling him to hold steady. Over the following weeks, Caleb's dislike sharpened. He complained about dog hair on the rug, muddy paw prints near the back door, and the smell of old leather from Ron's collar. He moved Ron's bed from the living room to the mudroom, saying guests should not have to step around a police dog. Then he moved the food bowl farther from the kitchen. Then he began closing doors Ron had always been allowed to pass through. Each change was small enough to explain. Together they felt like erasing. Ethan tried to put things back when Caleb was not watching. He dragged Ron's blanket near the hallway again. He filled the water bowl and set it by the warm vent. He brushed Ron in the shed behind the house and whispered stories about school, about a girl named Nora who always won spelling contests, about how he had almost raised his hand in history class but changed his mind. Ron listened to every word. Some boys had brothers. Ethan had a retired K9 with gray on his muzzle and patience in his bones. One Saturday morning, Ethan found Caleb standing in the den holding Daniel's framed photograph. In the picture, Daniel stood in uniform beside Ron, one hand resting on the dog's back. Ethan had always liked that photo because Daniel was not smiling for the camera. He was looking down at Ron, and Ron was looking up at him. It felt real. Caleb turned when Ethan entered. "This should be moved," he said. Ethan froze. "Why?" "Your mother needs to heal. She likes that picture. She feels obligated to keep it there because you keep living in the past." Ethan's face warmed. "I do not." Caleb stepped closer, still holding the frame. "You cry over a dog. You talk to a dead man's photograph. You walk around this house like a little ghost, waiting for another ghost to come home." Ethan's eyes stung, but he refused to look away. Ron appeared in the doorway. He made no sound. He simply stood there, shoulders square, ears forward, his body between Ethan and Caleb. Caleb looked at him and gave a short laugh. "See? This is what I'm talking about." Ron did not move. Grace came in a moment later and saw only the end of it. Caleb holding the photo, Ethan pale and silent, Ron blocking the doorway like a soldier at a gate. "What happened?" she asked. "Nothing," Caleb said smoothly. He set the photograph back on the shelf. "We were only talking." Ethan looked at his mother, hoping she would see the room correctly, hoping love could read what fear had not said. But Grace was tired. She rubbed her forehead and whispered, "Please, both of you, I cannot do this today." That was how Caleb won most days, not by proving he was right, but by exhausting everyone before the truth could stand up. Across town, Officer Jonathan Hayes had begun taking Hawthorne Lane more often than necessary. Jonathan was 45, a Briar Glen police officer and former partner of Daniel Miller. He had known Daniel for nearly 15 years. They had worked long shifts together, shared bad coffee in patrol cars, and once spent 6 hours searching the woods for a lost boy who had fallen asleep under a pine tree. Jonathan had been at Daniel's funeral. He had stood beside Grace. He had watched Ron refuse to leave the casket until Ethan touched his collar. Jonathan had never forgotten that. Lately, when his patrol route passed the Miller house, he noticed Ron in the front window. The old K9 did not look like a dog waiting for a walk. He looked like a guard watching a border. Once, Jonathan slowed his cruiser near the mailbox. Ron's eyes followed him, sharp and steady. Then the dog looked toward the side of the house, toward the gravel drive where Caleb's truck was parked. Jonathan felt something cold move beneath his ribs. The last case Daniel had worked before his death had never sat right with him. There had been rumors of illegal property transfers, missing records, and elderly homeowners pressured into signing documents they did not understand. Daniel had been careful, too careful to leave everything unfinished by accident. But after his death, the investigation faded. Files were reassigned, leads dried up. People told Jonathan grief made him suspicious. Maybe it had, or maybe grief had simply kept him from forgetting. That evening, Jonathan parked for a moment at the end of Hawthorne Lane. Snow drifted lightly through the glow of his headlights. From the Miller house, warm light spilled through the kitchen window. It looked peaceful from the road. Then Ron appeared at the front window again. The German shepherd stood very still. His ears were raised. His body was tense. He was not looking at Jonathan this time. He was looking back into the house. Jonathan watched for several seconds, one hand resting on the steering wheel. He almost got out. He almost walked to the porch and knocked. But there was no call, no complaint, no visible emergency. Only an old dog in a window and a feeling Jonathan could not put in a report. Inside the house, Ethan sat on the floor of his bedroom with Ron beside him. He had Daniel's old police badge box open in his lap. The badge itself was gone, kept by Grace in a safer place, but inside the box were small things: a folded memorial card, a photograph from a department picnic, and a strip of worn leather from one of Ron's old training leads. Ethan touched the leather carefully. "Do you think Dad knew?" he asked. Ron turned his head toward him. "I mean, about everything, about us, about Mom being sad, about Caleb." The dog blinked once. Ethan leaned against him. "I wish you could talk." Ron gave a quiet breath through his nose, almost like an old man hearing a foolish request and forgiving it. For the first time that day, Ethan smiled. Downstairs, Caleb's voice moved through the kitchen, low and controlled. Grace answered softly. Ethan could not hear the words, only the shape of them. He had heard that shape before. Caleb pressing, Grace yielding, a door closing somewhere that should have stayed open. Ron heard it too. His ears lifted. Then, very slowly, the old K9 stood and walked to Ethan's bedroom door. He did not bark. He did not growl. He only stared down the dark hallway, body still as stone. Ethan's smile faded. "What is it, boy?" Ron did not answer. Beyond the bedroom window, snow continued to fall over Briar Glen, covering rooftops, roads, and old secrets with the same soft white hand. But beneath that quiet, something in the Miller house had begun to shift. Something patient, something hidden, something Caleb Ross believed he could control. And at the end of the hallway, Daniel Miller's old K9 kept watch. By the time Ethan walked home from school that afternoon, the sky over Briar Glen had turned the color of old tin. Snow had not fallen heavily, but a thin white dust covered the sidewalks and gathered in the corners of porch steps. The air felt still, as if the town had lowered its voice before saying something terrible. Ethan kept his hands deep in his coat pockets as he followed Hawthorne Lane toward home. His backpack felt heavier than usual, though there was nothing inside except 2 books, a lunch container, and a history worksheet he had not finished because his mind had wandered to Ron. All day, Ethan had thought about the way Ron had stood at his bedroom door the night before. The old K9 had not barked or growled, but his body had gone stiff, and his ears had pointed down the hallway as though he had heard a secret moving through the walls. Ethan had told himself it was nothing. Old houses made sounds. Wind moved under doors. Adults argued in quiet voices and called it conversation, but Ron had never been wrong about danger, not once. When Ethan reached the Miller house, he stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Something felt wrong before he saw anything. Usually, by the time his shoes touched the first step, Ron would be waiting behind the front window, his ears high, his tail moving slowly but proudly, as if greeting Ethan was still part of an official duty. Sometimes he would bump the door with his shoulder, impatient but controlled, and Ethan would laugh because Ron acted like a retired officer who still believed school dismissal was a matter of public safety. Today, the window was empty. Ethan climbed the steps and opened the front door. The house was warm, but the warmth felt flat. No paws crossed the floor. No collar tag clicked softly from the hallway. No heavy breath came from the rug by the vent. Ethan stood with one hand still on the doorknob, listening. "Ron?" he called. Nothing answered. He stepped inside and set his backpack down without taking off his coat. The living room looked too neat. Ron's blanket was gone from beside the old armchair. The faded green blanket had been Daniel's once, then Ron's after the funeral, and it had always carried a faint smell of dog fur, wool, and cold mornings. Ethan looked toward the kitchen. Ron's water bowl was missing too. The floor where it usually sat had been wiped clean, not just moved, cleaned, as if someone had tried to remove the shape of it. His heart began to beat harder. "Mom?" There was movement in the kitchen. Ethan walked toward it and saw Caleb sitting at the table with his left hand wrapped in white gauze. Grace stood near the sink, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her face looked pale and tired, and her eyes moved to Ethan, then away from him. Caleb looked up slowly. His voice was calm, almost bored. "You are home early." "It is the same time," Ethan said. His eyes stayed on the bandage. "Where is Ron?" Grace closed her eyes for a moment. Caleb leaned back in his chair. "That dog bit me." The words entered the room like a cup dropped on a hard floor. Ethan stared at him. "No, he did not." Caleb's mouth tightened. "You were not here." "Ron would not bite you." "He did," Caleb said, raising the wrapped hand slightly. "Your mother saw enough. I called animal control. They came and took him." For a moment, Ethan did not understand the sentence. He heard each word, but they would not fit together. Animal control took him. Ron, the dog who had slept outside Ethan's door during fever nights. The dog who had let toddlers at the church picnic touch his ears without flinching. The dog who had once found Mrs. Adler's missing grandson in the woods and stood over him until help arrived. That dog did not belong in the back of an animal control van. Ethan turned to his mother. "Mom?" Grace's lips parted, but no words came at first. Caleb answered for her. "She knows what happened." Ethan looked at Grace harder. "Mom, tell him. Ron does not attack people." Grace gripped the edge of the sink. "Ethan, honey, it happened very fast." "What happened?" "We were talking," she said quietly. "Caleb and I were in the kitchen. Ron came in. He seemed upset." "He is always upset when Caleb is near him," Ethan said. "That does not mean he bit him." Caleb stood so quickly the chair legs scraped the floor. Ethan flinched, and he hated that he did. "Watch your tone," Caleb said. Grace stepped between them, not fully, but enough to soften the moment. "Please, Ethan. This is already hard." Ethan's eyes filled, but anger held the tears back for one more second. "Where did they take him?" Caleb looked at him as if the answer should not matter. "Maple Ridge Animal Shelter." Ethan knew the place. It sat near the old road outside town, beside the county maintenance yard. He had gone there once with his class to donate blankets. He remembered the smell of disinfectant, wet fur, and fear. He remembered dogs pressing their noses to metal doors. He turned toward the front hall. Grace reached for him. "Ethan, wait. We can talk about this." "No." "Ethan." He grabbed his backpack from the floor because his school ID and bus pass were inside, then pulled open the door. Caleb's voice followed him. "Running there will not change what that dog did." Ethan looked back once. His face was wet now, but his voice came out clear. "He did not do it." Then he ran. The road to Maple Ridge felt longer than it had ever felt. Ethan cut across the edge of the church parking lot, past the closed flower shop, and followed the sidewalk along County Road. Cars moved by slowly, their tires whispering through dirty snow. Twice, Ethan slipped and almost fell. Once, an older man outside the hardware store called after him, but Ethan did not stop. The cold burned his lungs. His backpack bounced against his shoulders. Tears blurred the road ahead until the world became white, gray, and broken by headlights. By the time he reached Maple Ridge Animal Shelter, his legs shook from running. The building was low and square, made of beige brick with a blue sign near the door. A string of faded holiday lights hung crookedly along the front window. Inside, the air was warmer but carried the sharp smell Ethan remembered. A woman behind the front desk looked up. She was Marcy Bell, a 56-year-old shelter receptionist who had worked there for many years and knew most of the town's strays by name before she knew half the people. She had kind eyes, but they tightened with concern when she saw Ethan standing there breathless and crying. "Sweetheart, are you all right?" "My dog," Ethan said, struggling for air. "They brought my dog here, German Shepherd. His name is Ron. He is old. He was a police K-9. Please, I need to see him." Marcy's face changed slightly at the name. She looked toward a clipboard, then toward the hallway behind her. "Who are you?" "Ethan Miller. He was my dad's dog. He is my dog now." Marcy hesitated. That small pause frightened Ethan more than if she had said no. "Please," he said. "I just need to see him." A man came from the back hallway carrying a metal food bowl. He was Greg Talbot, a 39-year-old animal control officer for the county. He was broad, tired-looking, and not unkind, but he had the cautious manner of someone used to being blamed for decisions other people made. He looked at Ethan, then at Marcy. "This the boy?" Greg asked quietly. Marcy nodded. Ethan stepped toward him. "Where is Ron?" Greg exhaled slowly. "He is in the back row." "Is he hurt?" "He is quiet." That was not an answer, and Ethan knew it. Greg opened the half door beside the desk. "Come on, but you cannot open the cage. Do you understand?" Ethan nodded quickly. They walked down a narrow hallway lined with kennel rooms. Dogs barked as Ethan passed. Some jumped against the doors, some backed away, some only watched with eyes that seemed too tired for their bodies. At the end of the hall, the noise grew thinner. The last room was colder than the others. A single row of cages faced a concrete wall, and at the very end, behind gray metal bars, Ron lay on his side. Ethan stopped breathing. Ron lifted his head. For 1 second, the old dog did not move. Then his ears rose, slow and uncertain. His eyes found Ethan's face, and something came alive behind them, not joy exactly, not yet, but recognition. He stood carefully. His black and tan coat looked dull under the fluorescent light. A red county tag hung from a temporary collar around his neck. His real collar was gone. "Ron," Ethan whispered. The dog came to the front of the cage and pressed his nose through the bars. Ethan dropped to his knees and put both hands against the metal. Ron touched his fingers and gave one soft breath. He didn't bark. He didn't jump. He didn't act dangerous. He only stood there, trembling as if he had been holding himself together until Ethan arrived. "They said you bit him," Ethan whispered. "I know you did not." Ron's eyes stayed on him. Behind Ethan, Greg cleared his throat. "Kid, I'm sorry." Ethan turned. "For what?" Marcy had followed them into the kennel room. Her clipboard was held against her chest now, and her eyes were wet. "There is a report," she said carefully. "The intake form says he attacked a household member. The request came with a signed statement." "He did not attack anyone." "I'm not saying he did," Marcy said. Ethan looked from her to Greg. "Then let him out." Greg's face tightened. "It is not that simple." "Why?" No one answered quickly enough. Ethan stood slowly. "Why?" Marcy looked down at the clipboard. When she spoke, her voice was barely above the hum of the lights. "He was marked as a dangerous dog. There is an order for euthanasia review in the morning." The word did not land at first. It was too large, too adult, too final. Then Ethan understood. "No," he said. Greg stepped closer. "It is scheduled for review. That does not always mean—" "No!" Ethan's voice cracked, and several dogs began barking again. Ron pressed harder against the bars, his ears forward, his body alert now, not aggressive, but protective even from inside the cage. Marcy touched Ethan's shoulder lightly. "Listen to me. There may still be time. Do you have another adult who can help? Someone with authority?" A family member? A police officer? A lawyer? Ethan's mind raced through names. His mother was afraid. Caleb had caused this. His teachers would not understand fast enough. Then he saw, as clearly as if the memory had walked into the room, a patrol car at the end of Hawthorne Lane and a man standing beside Daniel's casket with his hat in both hands. Officer Jonathan Hayes. Ethan wiped his face with his sleeve. "Yes," he said. "I know someone." He turned back to Ron. The old K9 watched him through the bars. "I will come back," Ethan whispered. "I promise." Ron made a low sound, not a bark, not a whine. It was the smallest broken note, the kind of sound an animal makes when it does not want to hope too loudly. Ethan ran again. Behind him, in the last cage of Maple Ridge Animal Shelter, Daniel Miller's old K9 remained standing long after the boy disappeared down the hallway. His nose stayed near the bars. His eyes stayed fixed on the door. And though the shelter lights hummed above him and the morning order waited on a clipboard, Ron did not lie down. Not yet. Ethan did not remember deciding to run to Jonathan's house. His feet seemed to know the way before his mind did. He left Maple Ridge Animal Shelter with the smell of metal cages still in his coat and Ron's quiet eyes burning in his chest. Snow moved across the road in thin white lines, not enough to blind him, just enough to make the town feel farther away than it was. By the time he reached the older neighborhood behind the police station, his lungs hurt and his cheeks were wet from cold and tears. Jonathan lived in a small brick house at the end of Willow Street, the kind of house that looked plain from the road but cared for up close. A porch light burned above the steps. A folded flag sat in the front window, and a pair of worn boots stood beside the door. Ethan climbed the porch and knocked so hard his knuckles stung. The door opened almost at once. Jonathan looked down at him, still wearing his dark police uniform pants and a gray sweatshirt with the Briar Glen Police Department printed across the chest. He had clearly been off duty, but his eyes changed the moment he saw Ethan's face. "Ethan?" The boy tried to speak, but the words broke apart. "They took him." Jonathan stepped outside and crouched slightly, bringing his voice lower. "Who took who?" "Ron," Ethan said, gasping. "Caleb said Ron bit him. He called animal control. They took Ron to Maple Ridge. They put him in the last cage, and they said tomorrow morning they might—" Ethan swallowed hard. "They said he is too dangerous." Jonathan did not move for a second. The name Ron seemed to cross the porch like an old command. Jonathan looked past Ethan into the falling snow, and for one brief moment, he was not on Willow Street anymore. He was standing 3 years earlier beside Daniel Miller's truck, 2 days before the accident, listening to Daniel speak in a voice that tried to sound casual and failed. "If anything ever happens to me," Daniel had said, one hand resting on Ron's back, "make sure he stays with Ethan. That dog knows the boy. He will guard him better than most people." Jonathan had laughed then, because men like Daniel often said dark things lightly before dangerous work. "Nothing is happening to you." Daniel had looked at him for a long second. "Promise me anyway," Jonathan had promised. Now Ethan stood on his porch shaking in the cold, and the promise rose from the past with teeth. Jonathan stood. "Get in the car." Ethan blinked. "You believe me?" "I believe Ron," Jonathan said, "and I believe you." He grabbed his coat, keys, and badge from a small table by the door. Within 2 minutes, Ethan was in the passenger seat of Jonathan's cruiser, hands wrapped around a paper napkin Jonathan had given him from the glove box. The car pulled away from the curb, tires crunching over frozen slush. Jonathan did not turn on the siren. He did not need noise. His face had gone still in a way Ethan had never seen before. "Tell me exactly what Caleb said," Jonathan asked. Ethan repeated it as best he could. The missing blanket, the empty place where the water bowl had been, Caleb's bandaged hand, Grace saying Ron had lunged while they were talking, the shelter, the last cage, the morning review. Jonathan listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, Jonathan asked, "Did Ron ever bite anyone before?" "No." "Ever threaten Caleb?" "He stood between us sometimes," Ethan said, "but he never attacked him. He only watched him." Jonathan's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "There is a difference." At Maple Ridge Animal Shelter, the front lights were still on, though the sky outside had already darkened. Marcy Bell looked up as Jonathan entered with Ethan beside him. Greg Talbot came from the back hallway a moment later and stopped when he saw the badge clipped at Jonathan's belt. "Officer Hayes?" Greg said carefully. Jonathan's voice stayed calm. I need to see the intake file on Ron Miller. Greg glanced at Marcy. The German Shepherd? Yes. Marcy reached beneath the desk and pulled out the clipboard. I was hoping someone would come. Jonathan looked at her. Why? She lowered her voice. Because that dog does not act like a dangerous animal. Greg said nothing, but his expression made it clear he agreed more than he wanted to say. Jonathan took the file and began reading. The top page was an animal control intake report. Male German Shepherd, senior, former working K9. Reported bite incident, household risk, owner request for euthanasia review, signed by Caleb Ross as responsible adult in the home. Jonathan turned the page. The bite description was short, too short. The reported wound was on Caleb's left hand, but there was no medical note attached, no photo, no witness statement beyond Grace's name written in a blank line, and no description of puncture depth. For a dog Ron's size, a true bite would not look like a vague scratch. Jonathan knew that from years around K9 units and too many reports written under fluorescent lights at 2 in the morning. He looked at Greg. Who took the call? Greg shifted his weight. Animal control dispatcher routed it to me. Who logged it? Marcy checked the computer. Initial call was entered by Travis Cole. A new name entered the room. Travis Cole was a 34-year-old part-time shelter intake worker who also handled county animal calls on busy days. He was not present that evening, but Jonathan knew the name. Travis had once worked seasonal jobs with Caleb Ross, back when Caleb handled insurance claims after storm damage. The connection was not proof of anything, but it was enough to make Jonathan keep reading. What time was the call? Jonathan asked. 3:42, Marcy said. Ethan looked up. I do not get home until after 4. Jonathan glanced at him, then back at the report. And when was the euthanasia review requested? Marcy's voice grew smaller. 4:28. Jonathan stared at the page. Less than an hour after intake. Greg rubbed a hand over his face. That is fast. It is more than fast, Jonathan said. It is careless. Marcy spoke quietly. Caleb said the dog was unpredictable and that there was a child in the home. He said the family wanted the risk removed before morning. Ethan's face twisted. I did not want that. I know, Marcy said gently. Jonathan closed the file. I'm placing a temporary hold on any euthanasia action until the bite report is reviewed and a veterinary behavior assessment is completed. Greg looked relieved but cautious. Can you do that? Jonathan held his gaze. For a former police K9 involved in a disputed bite report, yes, and if anyone has questions, they can call Chief Warren. Chief Samuel Warren was the 61-year-old head of the Briar Glen Police Department, a practical man with little patience for rushed paperwork and less patience for mistreated service animals. Jonathan did not know what Warren would say yet, but he knew the chief had respected Daniel. Marcy wrote the hold across the top of the file in red marker. Ethan watched each letter appear as if it were a rope being tied around Ron and pulled back from the edge. Can I see him? Ethan asked. Jonathan nodded. We both will. Greg led them to the back row. The kennel room smelled sharper now, colder. Ron was still standing at the bars of the last cage, exactly where Ethan had left him. When he saw Jonathan, his body changed. Not relaxed, but alert in a different way. His ears rose, his eyes focused. Jonathan stopped several feet away. Hey, partner, he said softly. Ron's tail moved once, only once. But Ethan saw it, and a small sound escaped him, half laugh, half sob. Jonathan did not reach through the bars. He had worked around enough K9S to know respect mattered, especially when a dog had been frightened or betrayed. He crouched slowly, keeping his hands visible. I'm sorry I'm late, he said. Ron stepped closer. His nose touched the bars near Jonathan's hand. The old dog breathed him in, searching through memory. Police station floors, winter patrol cars, Daniel's jacket, the long-ago scent of men who had stood on the same side of danger. Jonathan's throat tightened, but his voice remained steady. We are going to get this sorted out. Marcy stood behind them with the clipboard. There is one more thing, she said. Jonathan turned. When Ron came in, he had bruising near the shoulder. I did not examine him closely because I'm not the vet, but I saw it when he shifted. Greg nodded. I saw a mark near the neck, too. Could be from a catch pole, but I was careful. I did not yank him. Jonathan looked back at Ron. Then we need a vet tonight. He took out his phone and called Dr. Linda Mercer. Linda was 59, the town's most trusted veterinarian, and the kind of woman people called when an animal was hurt and the truth mattered more than comfort. She had treated retired police dogs before and had once told Daniel that Ron was better behaved than half the officers in the department. She arrived 25 minutes later wearing a heavy brown coat over blue clinic scrubs, her silver hair tucked under a knit hat, a medical bag in one hand. She came into the kennel room without drama, took one look at Ron, and slowed her steps. "Well," she said gently, "that is not the face of a dog looking for trouble." Ron watched her, uncertain. Linda did not open the cage immediately. She stood outside it and let him smell the air. Then she asked Greg to bring a slip lid but not tighten it. Jonathan stayed near Ethan, one hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder as Greg opened the cage door. Ron stepped out slowly. He stayed close to Ethan, but his eyes moved between Jonathan and Linda. The examination took time. Linda checked Ron's mouth, shoulders, neck, legs, and paws. Ron never snapped. He flinched once when Linda touched the left side of his neck, then lowered his head as if expecting correction. Ethan's face went pale. Linda noticed. She said nothing until she finished. Then she stood and looked at Jonathan. "This dog is not showing aggression. He is stressed, frightened, and sore." "From what?" Jonathan asked. She touched the air near Ron's shoulder without pressing again. "Light bruising here, a mark near the neck that may have come from hard restraint, not from normal handling, in my opinion. I cannot say who caused it, but I can say this animal looks more like he was forced into a situation than like he caused one." Ethan knelt beside Ron and pressed his forehead gently against the dog's neck. Ron stood still, then leaned into him with tired care. Jonathan looked at the file in Marcy's hands, then at the old K9. Daniel's promise no longer felt like memory. It felt like an order. "The hold stays," Jonathan said. "No one touches this dog without my knowledge or Dr. Mercer's approval." Greg nodded. Marcy did too. Ethan looked up at him with red eyes. "Can he come home?" Jonathan hesitated. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to put Ron in the cruiser and take him back to the porch where he belonged, but the house on Hawthorne Lane had just become part of the danger. "Not yet," Jonathan said gently. "Tonight, he stays safe here under the hold. Tomorrow, we start asking questions." Ethan swallowed hard, but he nodded. He was old enough to understand that safety was sometimes slower than love. Before they left, Jonathan let Ethan sit beside Ron in the quiet corner of the kennel room for a few more minutes. No one rushed him. The shelter dogs had settled. The lights hummed above them. Ethan held Ron's head in both hands and whispered, "You did not do it. I know you did not do it." Ron closed his eyes. Jonathan stood near the door, watching the boy and the dog Daniel had trusted with his son. Outside, snow gathered on the shelter roof. Inside, a red mark on a clipboard had bought them one night. Sometimes one night was all justice needed to find its footing. Morning came pale and quiet over Briar Glen, with a soft fall of snow drifting across the shelter parking lot. The town had not fully awakened yet. A few trucks moved along the county road, their tires whispering through slush, and the bare trees behind Maple Ridge Animal Shelter stood black against the gray sky. Ethan arrived with Jonathan before the front door was unlocked, his coat buttoned wrong and his eyes heavy from a night without real sleep. He had dreamed of Ron behind metal bars, standing in the last cage, waiting for a door that might never open. Marcy let them in with a tired smile. Greg was already in the back, finishing paperwork under Jonathan's temporary hold. Dr. Linda Mercer had sent a written note before sunrise, stating clearly that Ron showed no signs of uncontrolled aggression and should not be treated as a dangerous animal without further investigation. That note did not solve everything, but it was enough to open the cage. When Ron stepped out, Ethan almost ran to him. Jonathan placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "Slow," he said softly. Ethan stopped himself. He knelt instead and held out both hands. Ron came forward one careful step, then another. His ears were up, but his body still carried the stiffness of fear. When he reached Ethan, he lowered his head into the boy's hands. Ethan closed his eyes and pressed his forehead against Ron's fur. "I knew you would wait," Ethan whispered. Ron gave one deep breath as if the sound had been saved for him alone. Jonathan watched them for a moment, then signed the release form for temporary police custody and veterinary review. Ron was not being returned to the Miller house yet. Officially, he was being held as part of a disputed animal complaint. Unofficially, Jonathan had no intention of sending Daniel's old canine back into Caleb's reach before he understood what had really happened. Outside, the cold hit them hard. Ethan expected Ron to move toward Jonathan's cruiser. Instead, Ron stopped in the parking lot and lifted his head. His nose moved once, then again. He turned away from the car and stared down the road toward the west edge of town. "Ron?" Ethan said. The dog took 3 steps. Jonathan frowned. "Easy, boy." Ron did not look at him. He pulled gently at the leash, not hard enough to drag Ethan, but with a clear purpose. His paws pointed toward the old logging road that ran past the county yard and disappeared into the pine woods near Briar Lake. Ethan looked up at Jonathan. "He wants to go that way." Jonathan's face changed, not with surprise but recognition. "That road goes toward the north woods." "Did my dad go there?" Jonathan was quiet for a second too long. "He did, near the end." Those words settled over Ethan like another layer of snow. They drove slowly behind Ron's direction, with Ethan in the back seat beside him. Ron would not lie down. He sat upright, nose close to the window, watching every turn. When Jonathan reached the edge of town, Ron gave a low sound in his throat. Jonathan stopped at the entrance to a narrow road where the plow had only passed once. A faded wooden sign leaned near the ditch, half covered in snow. Briar Lake Road. Jonathan sat with both hands on the steering wheel. "Your father followed leads out here," he said. "I did not know all of them. Daniel became careful near the end. He stopped talking about certain names at the station. I thought he was protecting the case." "Was he?" Jonathan looked toward the trees. "Maybe he was protecting you and your mother." They got out. The road ahead was too rough for the cruiser, so Jonathan took a flashlight, a small evidence pouch from the glove box, and his radio. Ethan held Ron's leash, though it was clear Ron was the one leading them. Snow fell lightly through the pines, catching on the branches and dropping in soft whispers. The woods smelled of cold sap, wet bark, and frozen earth. Ron moved with new strength. He was not healed, not fully, but purpose had entered him. His paws followed the road for a while, then turned toward a narrow footpath almost hidden beneath brush. Ethan nearly missed it. Jonathan did not. "This was an old service trail," Jonathan said. "Hunters used it years ago." "Did Dad know about it?" "Your dad knew every forgotten trail in this town." Ethan held that sentence close. The path sloped down toward Briar Lake. Through the trees, the water appeared dark and still, edged with ice. Near the shore stood a cabin Ethan had never seen before. It was small, weathered, and partly hidden by pines. One window was cracked. The porch leaned to one side. Snow sat on the roof in uneven patches, and the front door hung slightly crooked, as if the building had been waiting too long for someone brave enough to knock. Ron stopped at the bottom step. He did not bark. He sat. Jonathan scanned the clearing. "Stay behind me." The door opened with a stiff groan. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust, old wood, and cold ashes. There was a stone fireplace against one wall, a broken chair near the window, and a table with one leg repaired by a piece of scrapboard. Nothing looked recently touched. Yet Ron stepped inside with careful certainty, crossed the room, and went to a corner near the fireplace. He lowered his nose to the floor. Ethan followed, his heartbeat loud in his ears. One floorboard near the wall looked darker than the others. It was warped at the edge, softened by years of damp air. Ron scratched once, then looked back at Jonathan. Jonathan crouched and ran his fingers along the board. "It is loose." He used the edge of his pocket knife to lift it. The wood came up with a low crack. Beneath it was a shallow space packed with old leaves and dust. Jonathan reached in carefully and pulled out a small metal box wrapped in a piece of oilcloth. Ethan stopped breathing. Jonathan set the box on the table. The latch was stiff but not locked. When he opened it, the first thing inside was a notebook. Ethan knew the handwriting before Jonathan said anything. "That is Dad's," he whispered. The notebook had a dark blue cover, worn at the corners. Several pages were filled with Daniel's careful notes. There were dates, addresses, initials, license plate numbers, and short observations written in the plain language of a police officer who knew facts had to survive fear. Jonathan turned the pages slowly, his face growing harder with each line. Inside the box were also several photographs, a folded town map marked in red pencil, and a small black USB drive sealed in a plastic bag. The photographs showed houses Ethan recognized from Briar Glen. Some belonged to older people who lived alone. One showed a storage building near the edge of town. Another showed a truck parked behind an abandoned feed store. Jonathan picked up the map. Red circles marked several properties across Briar Glen and the surrounding county. Beside some circles were notes: widow, no close family, unpaid taxes, pressured sale, transfer pending. Ethan did not understand every word, but he understood enough to feel cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. "What was Dad investigating?" he asked. Jonathan looked at the notebook. A network. Maybe more than one crime tied together. He read quietly, then more clearly. Possible illegal pain medication distribution through rural routes, cash moved through repair businesses and property purchases, elderly homeowners targeted for forced or fraudulent sales, records altered after signatures obtained. Ethan stared at him. "That happened here?" Jonathan nodded slowly. "It looks like your father thought so." Ron stood beside Ethan, eyes fixed on the box. The old dog seemed calmer now, as if some duty he had carried for 3 years had finally found human hands. Jonathan turned another page and stopped. Ethan saw the change in him. "What?" Jonathan did not answer at once. His thumb rested beside 2 letters written again and again in Daniel's notes: CR. The initials appeared next to 3 property transfers, a meeting behind the feed store, and a note about access to Miller household after DM incident. On the last page, Daniel had written one line that made Jonathan go very still. "If anything happens, Ron may be the only one who knows who came close." Ethan looked from the page to Ron. "CR," he said slowly. "Could that be Caleb Ross?" Jonathan closed the notebook, not fully, just enough to steady his hand. "It could be." "Did my dad know him?" "I do not know," Jonathan said. His voice was low now. "But I'm going to find out." For a moment, no one moved. Snow tapped softly against the cracked window. The lake beyond the trees lay silent, dark as a secret held too long. Ethan touched the edge of the notebook with 2 fingers, afraid to press too hard, as though the paper might still carry his father's warmth. "My dad hid this," Ethan said. "Yes." And Ron remembered. Jonathan looked at the old K9. Ron stood with his head raised, tired but certain, like a watchman who had finally led the living to the door the dead could no longer open. Jonathan gathered the notebook, photographs, map, and USB with care, placing each item into evidence bags from his cruiser kit. His movements were slow and respectful, not only because the items mattered to a case, but because they belonged to Daniel. They belonged to the unfinished part of a life taken too soon. Ethan stood near the fireplace, staring at the empty space beneath the floorboard. The cabin no longer felt abandoned. It felt like a message waiting in the woods, written by a father who had known danger was coming and trusted a dog to remember the way. Jonathan placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Ethan, this may get harder before it gets better." The boy nodded. His eyes were wet, but his voice did not shake. "Then we keep going." Ron moved closer and leaned against Ethan's leg. Outside, the snow continued to fall over Briar Lake, covering their footprints almost as soon as they made them. But the truth had already been disturbed. It had been lifted from beneath a rotten board, carried out of the cold, and placed back into the world. And somewhere in Briar Glen, Caleb Ross had no idea that the dog he tried to silence had just brought Daniel Miller's voice back from the grave. Jonathan did not take Daniel's box to the station right away. He knew better than to walk into a small police department with a dead officer's hidden evidence and start asking questions in the open. Briar Glen was not a large town. Secrets moved quickly there, not because people were cruel, but because quiet places had long ears. A clerk might mention a file, a dispatcher might repeat a name, a deputy might say the wrong thing at the diner. By sundown, Caleb could know everything. So Jonathan brought the evidence to his own kitchen table first. Ethan sat across from him with Ron lying near his feet, the old K9's head raised every time a car passed outside. The metal box sat between them like something dug up from another life. Snow tapped against the windows. The house smelled faintly of coffee and old wood, but Ethan could still smell the cabin on the notebook, damp paper, coal dust, and pine. Jonathan opened Daniel's notebook again. He didn't rush. Each page was dated, and each date was another step toward the truth Daniel had been carrying alone. The notes were not emotional. Daniel had never written that way. He had written like a policeman who trusted facts more than fear. Address, name, time, vehicle, witness, payment record, suspicious transfer. The handwriting was steady at first, then grew tighter near the final pages, as if Daniel had known the circle around him was closing. Ethan watched the letters as though they were his father's voice. Jonathan turned on his laptop and plugged in the USB drive. It took a few seconds to open. Inside were folders with plain labels: property, routes, names, photos, audio. Jonathan's face grew still. He opened a file that showed scanned property records from Vermont, New Hampshire, and northern New York. Several homes had belonged to elderly people. Some had been sold far below value. Some owners had later moved into assisted living facilities. Others had no family nearby to question anything. At the bottom of 3 transfer records, one name appeared under different business connections: Caleb Ross. Jonathan leaned closer. Then he found another file. Caleb had once used the name Caleb Rowe in New Hampshire. Before that, he had worked under the name C. Roswell as a real estate paperwork consultant for a company that no longer existed. The job titles changed, but the pattern stayed the same. He appeared near vulnerable property owners, handled documents, arranged emergency sales, and vanished before anyone had time to compare signatures, witnesses, or bank records. Ethan's voice was small. He changed his name? Jonathan did not look away from the screen. It appears that way. Why would someone do that? To leave old trouble behind, Jonathan said. Then, after a pause, or to make it harder for people to find the whole story. Ron gave a low breath and shifted closer to Ethan's chair. Jonathan opened the folder marked Photos. Several images showed the back lot of the abandoned feed store near Briar Glen. Caleb stood in one of them, younger by a few years but unmistakable, speaking to 2 men beside a white van. Another image showed the same van near a closed pharmacy outside town. A third showed boxes being moved at night behind a storage building. Daniel had written a note beneath the image: suspected medication diversion through rural delivery routes. Ethan did not fully understand the crime, but he understood his father had been brave enough to follow it. Jonathan opened the final folder, Audio. There were 3 short recordings, all rough and quiet. Daniel's voice appeared in one of them, low and careful, speaking into what must have been a recorder hidden in his jacket. Subject CR connected to property transfers and courier route. Possible link to Ross. Need confirmation before filing full report. Ron alerted twice near Miller House after unknown visitor. Do not ignore dog response. Ethan's chest tightened. He knew Ron noticed Caleb, Ethan whispered. Jonathan looked at him. He trusted Ron's judgment. The words landed gently, but they carried weight. For 3 years, Ethan had believed Ron was the last piece of his father's heart. Now he understood Ron may also have been the last witness his father trusted. Jonathan copied the files to an evidence drive and called Chief Warren from the kitchen. He kept his voice professional. He did not mention everything, only enough. Recovered materials connected to Daniel Miller's final investigation, possible fraud, possible link to an active local resident, need for a controlled review. Chief Warren listened without interrupting. When he finally spoke, his tone was older than usual. Bring it in tomorrow morning. Quietly. And Jonathan? Yes, Chief? Do not let the boy go home alone. Jonathan looked across the table at Ethan. I was not planning to. But Ethan did go home that evening, because Grace called 3 times and left messages that grew more frightened with each one. Jonathan drove him and Ron back to Hawthorne Lane, but he didn't leave the driveway until Ethan was inside. Ron stayed with Ethan on a loose leash. The old K9 hesitated at the front door, then entered with his ears forward. Inside, Caleb was waiting in the living room. His smile appeared before his warmth did. There you are. Your mother has been worried sick. Grace stood behind him near the hallway, twisting her hands together. She looked first at Ethan, then at Ron, and her face softened with relief before fear covered it again. Ethan, she said, are you all right? I'm fine, Ethan said. Ron is staying with me. Caleb's smile thinned. That dog is not staying in this house after what happened." Jonathan stepped in from the porch before Ethan could answer. "For tonight, Ron is under temporary police and veterinary review. He remains with Ethan unless there is a court order stating otherwise." Caleb looked at Jonathan, still smiling, but the smile no longer reached his eyes. "That seems excessive for a family matter." "A false, dangerous dog report is not only a family matter." Grace looked sharply at Caleb. "False?" Caleb turned to her with practiced patience. "He is using the word before anything is proven. Do not let people upset you." Jonathan did not argue. He had seen men like Caleb before, men who tried to turn every question into an attack and every concern into confusion. He simply looked at Grace. "If anything feels unsafe tonight, call me," he said. Grace nodded, though Caleb's hand settled lightly on her shoulder as if reminding her who stood closer. After Jonathan left, the house became polite in the worst way. Caleb spoke softly. He offered tea. He asked Ethan if the shelter had frightened him. He even looked at Ron and said he hoped the dog could be helped. But beneath every gentle word was a warning. Later, Ethan sat on the stairs and listened. Caleb and Grace were in the kitchen. Caleb's voice was low, but Ethan could hear pieces. "This town is turning him against us." "He is a child, Caleb. He needs a clean start. You both do. This house keeps him sick with grief." Grace answered quietly, "It is his home." "It is a house, Grace. A house with old pain in every room. We could sell before winter ends, move south, get him better schools, a safer neighborhood, no police memories on every wall." "And Ron?" A pause. "Ron is part of the problem." Ethan looked down at the old K9 beside him. Ron didn't move, but his eyes were open. The next morning, Grace found the papers. It happened because Caleb left too early and forgot to lock the drawer in the small desk near the den window. Grace was looking for an insurance bill. She opened the drawer, moved a stack of envelopes, and saw a folder with her name typed across the front. Inside were transfer documents for the Miller house. Some pages had sticky notes marking where she should sign. Another set listed Ethan as a minor beneficiary whose interest could be handled by his surviving parent. Grace sat down slowly. At the top of one page was the name of a property investment company she had never heard Caleb mention. The buyer's offer was low, much lower than the house was worth. The closing date was already penciled in. Caleb had not been asking her to consider selling. He had been preparing the sale as if her agreement were only a small obstacle to be managed. Her hands began to shake. For the first time, Grace saw the pattern not as stress, not as Caleb trying to help, not as a man impatient with grief, but as something colder. Ron removed. Ethan frightened. Daniel's photograph nearly taken down. The house described as poison. A sale arranged before she had said yes. That afternoon, she watched Caleb return from town and place his kind smile back on his face like a coat. He kissed her cheek. "You look tired." Grace almost asked him about the folder. She almost held it up and demanded an answer. But something stopped her. Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps it was wisdom arriving late. Instead, she said, "I didn't sleep well." "You need less stress," Caleb said. "We all do." Grace looked toward the hallway where Ethan sat with Ron, reading Daniel's notebook under Jonathan's supervision. The boy's shoulders were hunched, but his face was different. Sad, yes. Frightened, yes, but also lit by something she had not seen in years. Connection. Ethan had found one passage he could not stop reading. Daniel had written it near the middle of the notebook between a list of license plates and an address outside town. Ron is more than a K9. He is a four-legged soldier who knows how to stay silent when a person needs to cry. If I do not come home, I pray Ethan understands that courage is not always loud. Sometimes it lies beside you in the dark and waits until you can breathe again. Ethan traced the words with one finger. For the first time since the funeral, his father did not feel trapped in a photograph or buried beneath a stone. He felt near. Not alive, not in the way Ethan wished every night, but present through ink, through memory, through Ron's warm body pressed against his knee. Ethan whispered, "He was talking to me." Jonathan, seated nearby, said quietly, "Yes, I think he was." Ron lowered his head onto Ethan's shoe. In the kitchen, Grace watched them. Her eyes filled, but she did not wipe the tears away. Behind her, Caleb continued speaking about fresh starts, warmer towns, and leaving the past behind. His voice was smooth, reasonable, almost tender. But Grace was no longer listening the same way. She had seen the papers. She had seen Ron return from a cage Caleb had sent him to. She had seen Ethan hold his father's notebook like a boy, holding a hand across time. And for the first time since she married Caleb Ross, Grace wondered whether the man who smiled so kindly in public had not come to heal her family at all. Maybe he had come to finish what Daniel Miller had interrupted. By the next morning, Jonathan had stopped treating Ron's case like a misunderstanding and began treating it like the edge of something larger. He moved quietly, but not slowly. First, he returned to Maple Ridge Animal Shelter and collected copies of Ron's intake record, the dangerous dog request, the call log, and the temporary euthanasia review form. Marcy gave him everything she could without making the room feel official enough to scare people into silence. Greg added his own written note, stating that Ron had not behaved aggressively during transport and that Caleb's description of the bite had seemed unusually vague. Then Jonathan went to Dr. Linda Mercer's clinic. Linda had already prepared a short medical assessment written in clear language that would hold up better than emotion. Ron showed signs of stress. Ron showed bruising near the shoulder and neck. Ron showed no bite behavior during handling. There was no evidence, in her professional opinion, that Ron was a naturally aggressive dog or a public danger. Jonathan read the note twice, then folded it into the growing file with Daniel's notebook, the USB drive, and the property papers Grace had not yet dared to discuss out loud, but the most important piece came from across the street. Mrs. Helen Carver was 72, a retired school librarian who lived in the blue house opposite the Millers and had a small security camera above her garage because someone once stole a Christmas wreath from her front door. She knew Ethan from the library's summer reading program and had known Daniel well enough to call him that good officer with the serious dog. When Jonathan knocked, she invited him in before he finished explaining. Her house smelled of cinnamon tea and old books, and she moved with the careful speed of someone who did not want age to be mistaken for helplessness. "I do not like Caleb Ross," Mrs. Carver said, leading Jonathan to a small computer in her sitting room. "I have tried to like him. I believe in giving people room to become better, but some men take up too much room and improve nothing." Jonathan almost smiled. "I need to see your camera footage from the afternoon Ron was taken. I thought you might." The video was grainy, angled from across the road, and partly blocked by the maple tree in Mrs. Carver's yard. Still, it showed enough. At 3:18 in the afternoon, Ethan had not yet come home. Caleb stepped out the side door with Ron following several feet behind. Ron's body looked alert but not aggressive. A moment later, Caleb picked up a wooden garden stake from beside the porch and jabbed it toward the dog. Jonathan leaned closer. Ron backed away. Caleb advanced again. The dog did not lunge. He did not bite. He moved sideways, placing himself between Caleb and the front walk, the same path Ethan would take when he came home from school. Caleb raised the stake a third time. Ron barked once, sharp and warning, then stood his ground. Then Caleb did something that made Jonathan's jaw tighten. He dropped the stake, glanced toward the road, and dragged the edge of his own hand hard along a broken piece of metal fencing near the porch. He looked at the scratch, squeezed it until blood appeared, then wrapped it in a handkerchief. Minutes later, the county animal control van arrived. Mrs. Carver folded her arms. "That dog never touched him." "No," Jonathan said. "He did not." He was protecting the boy's path home. Jonathan looked at the screen again. Ron had stood exactly where Daniel would have stood. Between danger and family, not attacking, holding the line. Jonathan saved a copy of the footage. He thanked Mrs. Carver and drove away with the file on the seat beside him, heavier now in every sense. By late afternoon, he had enough to challenge Caleb's story. But he needed Grace, not as a name on a statement, not as a frightened wife standing behind Caleb's shoulder, but as a mother willing to say what she had seen, what she had ignored, and what she now understood. At the Miller house, Grace reached that point sooner than anyone expected. Caleb had been restless all day. He moved through the rooms as if the walls had started whispering against him. He checked the front window twice. He made 3 calls from the kitchen, lowering his voice each time Grace walked near. He asked where Ethan was, though Ethan was at Jonathan's house with Ron under police supervision. He asked whether Jonathan had said anything to her. He asked if she had touched the desk drawer. That last question told Grace he knew. She said, I was looking for the insurance bill. Caleb watched her for a long moment, then smiled. You should ask me before going through papers you do not understand. There it was again, the soft voice with a locked door inside it. Grace did not answer. She went upstairs, folded laundry she had already folded, then came back down when she heard Caleb's phone ring. He stepped into the den and closed the door almost all the way, but not completely. In a different life, Grace might have walked away. She had spent months walking away from small warnings because she did not want another broken home, another grieving child, another reason to admit she had chosen wrong. This time, she stopped in the hallway. Caleb's voice was low, but clear enough. No, the dog is not gone, he said. Hayes interfered. A pause. I know what the K9 was. That is the problem. He remembers scents. He knows who came near Daniel. He knows too much. Grace's hand went to the wall. Caleb continued, sharper now. And the boy is just like his father, quiet, then suddenly digging where he should not. I told you we needed the house transfer finished before this started. Another pause. No. Grace is manageable. She wants peace. She will sign if I push the right way. The hallway seemed to tilt beneath her. Manageable. The word was so plain, so ugly in its calmness, that it cleared the fog from her mind more quickly than any insult could have. Caleb had not married her because he loved her grief and wanted to help carry it. He had studied it. He had used it like a key. She will believe me over a dog, Caleb said. She already did once. Grace closed her eyes. That was the moment the shame came, not as a slap, but as a wave. She saw Ethan standing in the kitchen, crying and begging her to believe Ron. She saw herself looking away because believing her son would have meant facing the man beside her. She saw Ron in the last cage, marked dangerous by a lie she had helped protect with silence. When Caleb ended the call, Grace was already moving. She went upstairs first, not to pack, not yet, but to steady her hands. She opened the closet where Daniel's old jacket still hung in a garment bag. She touched the sleeve once. It was not a prayer exactly, but it was close. I'm sorry, she whispered. Then she went back to the den. Caleb had left the house 10 minutes later, saying he needed to meet a client. Grace waited until his truck pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down Hawthorne Lane. Only then did she open the desk drawer. This time, she didn't pretend she was looking for a bill. She took the property folder, the unsigned transfer documents, the low purchase offer, the sticky notes marking her signature lines, and a smaller envelope tucked beneath them. Inside were copies of Caleb's old business cards. Caleb Rowe, C. Roswell Consulting, Ross Property Solutions. Her breath caught. The names matched what Jonathan had found. Grace placed everything into a grocery bag because it was the only bag near her, and because the ordinary shape of it kept her from falling apart. Then she took her coat, locked the front door, and walked quickly to her car. She did not call Caleb. She did not leave a note. For once, she did not try to explain herself to the person who had trained her to ask permission for truth. Jonathan opened his door before Grace knocked twice. Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table with Ron beside him, one hand buried in the dog's fur. When Ethan saw his mother, he stood too fast. His face held hope and fear in equal measure. Mom? Grace looked at him, and the apology in her eyes arrived before the words did. I should have believed you, she said. Ethan didn't move. Grace held the grocery bag against her chest. I heard Caleb on the phone. I found the papers. He was trying to sell the house. He knew about Daniel's investigation. He knew Ron could recognize him. Jonathan took the bag from her carefully and spread the documents across the table. His expression changed as he saw the names, the transfer forms, and the marked signature lines. He added Mrs. Carver's video drive beside them, then placed Linda's report on top of the file. For the first time, the story had shape from every side. Caleb's false injury, Ron's bruises, the shelter order, Daniel's notebook, the hidden USB, the property papers, Grace's testimony, the old names Caleb had tried to bury. Ethan looked at his mother. His voice was quiet. You believe Ron now? Grace's face broke. Yes, she said, and I believe you. Ron rose slowly and walked toward her. Grace froze, not from fear, but from shame. The old K9 stopped in front of her and looked up. He did not wag his tail. He did not offer easy forgiveness like a storybook animal. He only stood there, steady and breathing, the same dog she had failed to defend. Grace knelt and lowered her head. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Ron sniffed her sleeve, then turned and went back to Ethan. It was not forgiveness yet. It was something more honest. A door not opened, but no longer locked. Jonathan gathered the papers into a secure folder. "Grace, I need a formal statement from you tonight." She nodded. "I will give it. And after that, you and Ethan cannot go back to that house alone." Grace looked at Ethan. He looked at Ron. For the first time in days, no one argued with the truth. Outside, evening settled over Briar Glen. Lights came on in quiet houses. Snow softened the roads and rooftops. Somewhere across town, Caleb Ross still believed he had time to smile his way through the damage he had made. But the mother he thought he could manage had just chosen her son, and the dog he tried to silence had survived long enough for the truth to learn how to speak. Caleb was arrested on a cold Thursday morning, just as the sun began to rise over Briar Glen and turn the snowbanks pale gold. He didn't shout when the officers came. He did not run. Men like Caleb rarely imagined themselves being taken away in front of neighbors. They were too used to standing in clean shirts, speaking in calm voices, and letting other people look guilty for them. When Jonathan arrived with Chief Warren and 2 deputies, Caleb opened the door wearing the same polite expression he had worn at church dinners and school events. For a moment, he even smiled. "This is unnecessary," Caleb said. Chief Warren did not argue. "Caleb Ross, you are being taken into custody on charges related to fraud, false reporting, obstruction, and conspiracy. There may be additional charges pending." Grace stood beside Ethan across the street at Mrs. Carver's house, where Jonathan had asked them to stay until the arrest was complete. Ethan watched through the front window. Ron stood beside him, ears forward, body still. The old K9 did not bark when Caleb was led down the porch steps. He only watched, and somehow that silence felt stronger than any growl could have been. The first hearing came quickly because the property transfer had been scheduled to close within days. By then, Jonathan and Chief Warren had sent Daniel's notebook, the USB files, Mrs. Carver's video, Linda's veterinary report, the shelter documents, and Grace's statement to the county prosecutor. The prosecutor assigned to the case was Evelyn Harper, a 49-year-old assistant district attorney known for handling fraud and elder abuse cases with quiet patience and sharp precision. She didn't speak dramatically. She didn't need to. She built cases the way winter built ice, layer by layer, until what looked thin became impossible to ignore. The courtroom was small, with wooden benches, old lights, and tall windows that looked out over the courthouse lawn. Snow clung to the steps outside. Inside, people sat shoulder to shoulder, not because the town wanted gossip, but because Daniel Miller's name had been spoken again after 3 years of silence. Some came for Daniel, some came for Grace. Some came because they had once signed papers they did not fully understand and now wondered whether their own losses had been accidents at all. Caleb sat at the defense table in a navy jacket and a pale shirt, his hair neatly combed, his face arranged into concern. Beside him was his attorney, Martin Sloan, a 55-year-old criminal defense lawyer from Burlington whose role was to make doubt sound reasonable. He spoke softly with Caleb before the judge entered, and Caleb nodded at the right moments, like a man being unfairly misunderstood. Judge Rebecca Langford, 63, a county judge with a steady voice and little patience for performance, took the bench just after 9. She looked over her glasses at the room, then at the files before her. "This is a preliminary hearing," she said. "We are here to determine whether sufficient cause exists to proceed on the charges and to address immediate protective orders concerning the property and the animal complaint." Ron was allowed in the courtroom only after Linda provided a written behavior statement, and Jonathan agreed to keep him beside Ethan on a loose lead. He lay under the bench near Ethan's feet, not fully relaxed, but calm. His head rested on his paws. His eyes stayed open. Caleb's attorney spoke first. He presented Caleb as a man trying to protect his wife and stepson from a dangerous animal. He said the house had been strained by grief, that Ethan had formed an unhealthy attachment to a former police dog, and that Caleb had suffered a hand injury during a frightening moment in the kitchen. He described Caleb as a stepfather who had made a difficult decision under pressure. Grace looked down when she heard that. Ethan felt her hand tighten around his. Then Evelyn Harper stood. She did not raise her voice. She placed one folder on the table and began with the dog. She called Linda first. Linda wore a dark green coat over her clinic clothes and spoke with the plain certainty of someone who had spent her life reading animals better than many people read words. She explained that Ron showed stress and bruising, but no signs of uncontrolled aggression. She described his behavior during examination, how he flinched at pressure near the neck, how he never lunged, snapped, or attempted to bite anyone. Martin Sloan asked, "Doctor, is it possible for a large German Shepherd to be dangerous, even if he appears calm during an exam?" Linda answered without hesitation. "Anything with teeth can be dangerous under the wrong circumstances. That includes dogs, people, and frightened men with something to hide." A low murmur moved through the room before Judge Langford called for quiet. Linda continued more carefully. "In my professional opinion, this dog was not acting like an aggressor. He was acting like an animal who had been threatened and restrained." Next came Marcy Bell. She sat nervously on the witness stand, hands folded in her lap. She admitted that Caleb had pushed for Ron to be marked as dangerous and had insisted the euthanasia review be scheduled as soon as possible. She said he sounded calm, not frightened. She also confirmed that Ethan had never agreed to surrender Ron and that Grace had not been present at the shelter to sign anything. Greg followed. He testified that Ron did not resist transport in a violent way. The dog was tense, but controlled. He also stated that Caleb's injury did not match what he expected from a serious bite by a dog Ron's size. Then Jonathan took the stand. He brought Daniel's file with him, not as a friend carrying memory, but as an officer carrying evidence. He explained the cabin near Briar Lake, the metal box hidden under the floorboard, and the documents inside. He described the USB files showing suspicious property transfers, false consulting names connected to Caleb, and photographs placing Caleb near people Daniel had been investigating before his death. Evelyn showed the court Mrs. Carver's video. The footage appeared on a screen at the front of the room. It was grainy, but clear enough. Caleb stepped out with the wooden stake. Ron backed away. Caleb advanced. Ron placed himself between Caleb and the front walk. Then, Caleb scratched his own hand on the broken fencing. No one spoke. Ethan could hear his own heartbeat. Beside him, Ron lifted his head. Evelyn paused the video on the moment Ron stood between Caleb and the path Ethan used every day after school. "This is the alleged attack," she said. "The dog never touches him." Caleb's face did not change much, but his eyes did. Ethan saw it. Grace saw it too. Then Grace testified. She walked to the stand slowly, but she did not look as fragile as she had in the Miller kitchen. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied as she described the pressure Caleb had placed on her, the papers she found, the phone call she overheard, and the moment she realized he had prepared to sell the house before she had agreed. She admitted she had believed Caleb over Ethan at first. That was the hardest part. Ethan saw it in the way she swallowed before saying the words. "I was tired," Grace said. "I wanted peace so badly that I mistook control for help. But my son told the truth. Ron did not attack Caleb. Caleb used my fear to make me doubt the two beings in that house who were still trying to protect me." Ethan lowered his eyes. Ron's head pressed lightly against his shoe. The final part of the hearing widened the case beyond the Miller home. Evelyn introduced records from Daniel's USB and recent financial subpoenas. Caleb's names appeared across several companies connected to pressured property transfers. Older residents had signed away homes under confusing terms. Money had moved through accounts tied to medication routes and shell businesses. Daniel had been close to connecting the network before his death. Caleb had not acted alone, but he had been one of the men who made the paperwork look clean enough to hide the harm. Judge Langford listened without expression, but her notes grew longer. Martin Sloan objected often. Some objections were sustained, some were not, but the shape of the truth remained. Caleb had tried to remove Ron because Ron threatened the lie. He had tried to move Grace and Ethan out of the house because the house stood in the way of the transfer. He had smiled in public while planning to take what grief had left behind. Near the end, Evelyn asked whether Ethan could make a brief victim statement about Ron. Judge Langford allowed it, with care. Ethan stood. He was small in the courtroom, smaller than the lawyers, smaller than the bench, smaller than the shadow of everything that had happened, but his voice carried. "Ron did not bite him," Ethan said. "Ron never hurt anyone who did not need stopping. He stood between Caleb and the way I come home from school. That is what my dad used to do. My dad stood between bad things and people who needed help." He looked at Caleb for the first time, not with hate, but with a kind of sadness too old for 12. "Ron only did what my father taught him. He stood between evil and our family." The courtroom went very quiet. Caleb looked away. That was the first honest thing his face had done all day. Judge Langford ruled that there was sufficient cause to proceed on multiple charges. She ordered Caleb held pending further proceedings and placed an immediate freeze on the Miller house transfer. She also dismissed the dangerous dog claim for lack of evidence and ordered that Ron remain in Ethan and Grace's care under Linda's follow-up supervision. It was not the final end of the larger case. More names would be investigated, more documents would be opened, more people would have to answer for what had been done under polite signatures and friendly smiles. But for Ethan, one truth mattered most in that moment. Ron was not dangerous. Ron was coming home. As the hearing ended, Jonathan stood near the aisle while Caleb was escorted out. Caleb passed close enough to speak, but he said nothing. His smile was gone now. Without it, he looked smaller. Grace placed one arm around Ethan. Ron rose slowly beside them, steady and quiet. Jonathan looked at the old K9, then at the boy Daniel had left behind. For 3 years, Jonathan had carried the ache of a promise he thought he had failed to keep. That morning, in a small Vermont courtroom, the promise finally found its way back to the light. The final sentence against Caleb did not arrive with thunder. It came on a clear morning in early December, in the same county courthouse where the truth had first found room to breathe. By then, the larger investigation had spread beyond Briar Glen. Other names had been added to the case. Other victims had come forward. Some were elderly homeowners who had signed papers they never understood. Some were families who had lost property after being pressured, misled, or frightened into silence. Caleb was not the only man involved, but he had been one of the faces that made the cruelty look respectable. When the judge read the decision, Grace sat with Ethan on one side and Jonathan on the other. Ron lay at Ethan's feet, calm but watchful, his old black and tan body resting on the polished courtroom floor. The dangerous dog claim was already gone. The false report had been exposed. The attempted transfer of the Miller house had been voided. Caleb was convicted on multiple charges tied to fraud, false reporting, and conspiracy, with further proceedings continuing for the wider network he had helped protect. Ethan did not feel joy when Caleb was led away. He had expected he might. Instead, he felt something quieter, the kind of relief that comes after carrying a heavy bucket for too long and finally setting it down. Caleb looked back once, not at Ethan, not at Ron, but at Grace. There was no apology in his face, only disbelief that the story had not ended the way he had written it. Grace did not lower her eyes this time. That was enough. In the weeks that followed, the Miller house changed slowly. Grace did not sell it. She did not flee from it either. For a while, she thought leaving might be easier. Every room carried a memory of being manipulated. The kitchen held the echo of Caleb's calm voice. The den held the drawer where the papers had been hidden. The hallway held the silence where she had failed to believe her own son. But one evening, Ethan found her standing in the living room with Daniel's photograph in her hands. The frame had been placed back on the shelf after the hearing, but not yet hung where it belonged. Grace stared at it for a long time. In the picture, Daniel stood beside Ron in uniform, his hand resting on the dog's back. Ron looked young then, strong and bright-eyed, as if the whole world were a trail he could follow home. "I kept thinking this house was full of pain," Grace said. Ethan stood beside her. "Isn't it?" Grace nodded slowly. "Some of it, but not only pain." The next day, she bought fresh nails, a small level, and a new frame for the photograph because the old one had cracked at the corner. She hung Daniel and Ron back on the living room wall, not high and distant, but where they could be seen from the kitchen table. Then she placed Ron's blanket beside the fireplace again. It was washed, brushed, and folded neatly, but it still looked like his blanket. That mattered. Ron inspected it with grave seriousness, sniffed once, turned in a slow circle, and settled down as if approving the restoration of an ancient kingdom. Ethan laughed for the first time in days. Grace laughed too, though tears came with it. The sound surprised all three of them. Even Ron lifted his head, as if laughter in that room had become a rare bird and he wanted to make sure it was safe. Little by little, the house stopped holding its breath. Grace painted the den a soft blue, not to erase what had happened, but to give the room back to sunlight. Ethan helped replace the broken latch on the back door. Jonathan came by on Saturdays, sometimes with tools, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with no reason he admitted to. He never acted like he was taking Daniel's place. That was one of the reasons Ethan trusted him. Jonathan simply arrived, stayed useful, and left without asking the family to name what he was becoming. Ron recovered more slowly. He still woke at certain sounds. He still stood between Ethan and the door when strangers knocked. But the fear in his body began to loosen. Dr. Linda Mercer visited twice and said progress in old working dogs often looked like small choices. Ron choosing to sleep by the fire instead of guarding the hall. Ron choosing to eat while Grace stood nearby. Ron choosing to place his head on Ethan's knee in the middle of the afternoon for no reason except comfort. Those were victories, quiet ones, but real. On the first Sunday after the sentencing, Ethan asked to visit the cemetery. The hill above Briar Glen rose behind the old white church, where the cemetery overlooked the town, the frozen river, and the dark line of pines beyond the fields. Snow lay thin across the graves, the sky was clear, and the late afternoon sun turned the hills gold at the edges. Grace drove, with Ethan in the back beside Ron. Jonathan followed in his own car, not because they needed protection, but because some promises were easier to keep when no one had to explain them. Daniel Miller's grave stood beneath an old maple tree. The stone was simple, with his name, his dates, and the words, "Beloved father, husband, officer, and friend." Someone from the department had cleared the snow from the base earlier that week. A small American flag stood near the marker, moving gently in the cold wind. Ethan stepped forward first. He held Daniel's old K9 patch in both hands. It had been found in the badge box, faded at the edges but still intact. For a while, Ethan had kept it on his desk. Then he decided it belonged here, at least for a little while. "Hi, Dad," he said. The words were small, but they did not break. Grace stood behind him, one hand at her mouth. Jonathan remained a few steps back, giving them room. Ron walked slowly to the stone. He sniffed the ground near the base, then lowered himself beside the grave with a tired sigh. He placed his head between his paws and became very still. Ethan set the patch against the stone. "We found what you hid," he said. Ron remembered the way. The wind moved through the bare branches above them. Somewhere down in town, a church bell rang once, then faded. Grace knelt beside Ethan. For a moment she seemed unable to speak. Then she touched the cold stone with her fingertips. "Daniel," she whispered, "I am sorry. I was lonely, and I let that loneliness become louder than the truth. I should have trusted our son. I should have trusted Ron." Her voice trembled, but she continued. "You protected us longer than I knew, even after you were gone." Ethan took her hand. Grace turned to him, tears on her face. "And you protected me too." Ethan leaned into her. He didn't say it was all right because some things were not all right just because people were sorry. But he held her hand, and that was the beginning of something honest. Jonathan stepped closer then. He removed his hat and looked at Daniel's name on the stone. For a long moment, he was silent. When he spoke, his voice was low. "You were right about Ron," he said. "And you were right about your boy." Ron lifted his head slightly at Jonathan's voice, then rested it against Ethan's leg. The old K9 looked tired, but not defeated. He looked like a soldier who had crossed a long battlefield and finally heard the order to rest. The sun sank lower over Vermont, casting warm light across the cemetery hill. For 3 years, Ethan had thought losing his father meant the story of courage had ended. Now he understood it had changed shape. It had become a notebook hidden beneath a cabin floor. It had become an old dog refusing to forget. It had become a mother brave enough to admit the truth. It had become a policeman who kept a promise late, but kept it. And it had become a boy who learned that family was not only the people who shared your name, family was the ones who stayed when fear told them to run. That evening, they returned to the Miller house. Grace made soup. Ethan set the table. Jonathan fixed the porch light that had been flickering for weeks. Ron lay by the fireplace on his old blanket, watching them with calm eyes. When the wind moved outside, he lifted his ears, but he didn't rise. Not every sound was danger anymore. Later, after Jonathan left and the dishes were washed, Ethan sat on the floor beside Ron. The photograph of Daniel and Ron looked down from the wall. Grace stood in the doorway, wrapped in a cardigan, smiling through the kind of sadness that no longer needed to hide. "You ready for bed?" she asked. "In a minute," Ethan said. Ron placed his head on Ethan's lap. Ethan rested one hand on the dog's neck, feeling the steady warmth beneath the fur. For the first time in a long time, the house had a sound it had been missing. Not barking, not crying, not whispered arguments behind closed doors. It was peace, and beside the fire, Daniel Miller's old K9 no longer guarded the door because he was afraid of what might enter. He guarded it because the people inside were his family, and love, once given a home again, has always known how to keep watch. In the end, Ethan's story was never only about a boy, a dog, or a house nearly stolen by lies. It was about trust. It was about the quiet kind of loyalty that does not need to shout to be strong. Ron could not explain himself in human words. He could not stand in court with a raised hand and tell everyone what really happened, but he stayed. He remembered. He protected. And when the time came, he led the truth back into the light. This story reminds us that evil often hides behind kind smiles, careful words, and promises that sound safe. But love has its own memory. A loyal heart does not forget the people it was meant to protect. Ethan learned that courage is not always about being fearless. Sometimes courage is a crying child running through the snow to save his dog. Sometimes it is a mother admitting she was wrong. Sometimes it is an old officer keeping a promise. And sometimes it is a tired German shepherd standing guard one more time because family still needs him. Daniel Miller may have been gone, but his love never truly left. It lived on in his son, in the truth he hid, and in the brave K9 who refused to let that truth die. So what did this story make you feel? Do you believe animals can sense danger before people do? And have you ever known a loyal dog who protected someone with all his heart? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear from you.